Picture this, a world that moves with the sun and the seasons, where every meal tells a story, woven from earth, tradition, and survival. This isn't just about food. It's a quiet language spoken across medieval tables, filled with surprises you wouldn't expect. Tonight, we explore the strange and wonderful dishes of the past, meals that could be art, mystery, and comfort all at once. From gilded peacocks to bread brewed into potions, each bite carries a whisper of distant lands and forgotten customs. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, ease yourself into comfort. Adjust your pillows, wrap yourself in a soft blanket, and let your mind drift slowly through these gentle echoes of history. In the soft glow of ancient hearths, let's begin this quiet journey, one savory story at a time. In the quiet corners of medieval kitchens, where the hearth was the heart of the home, something soft and familiar often simmered from sunrise to dusk. It was called pottage, a thick, unhurried stew that carried the rhythm of daily life in its slow, bubbling breath. At its base were grains, barley, oats, or rye, soft in water until they bloomed into something dense and comforting. To this, anything might be added. A knob of last year's onion, a handful of lentils, a few shriveled herbs hanging low near the chimney, a faint earthiness from the grains, a green edge from nettle or parsley, and if luck allowed, the whisper of meat rendered into richness. On the coldest mornings, before the day began in earnest, this quiet meal warmed bellies and fingers alike. Its color ranged from a pale, milky gray to deep brown, depending on what found its way in. There were no garnishes, no presentation, but at its core, it remained the same, a base, a warmth, a constant. Whether it was sipped in silence by a monk in a drafty stone cell, or scooped up by tired hands after a long day in the fields, it offered the same thing, a moment of fullness, of stillness, of peace. It was eaten with wooden spoons, by the fire, beneath low beams stained with centuries of smoke. A hint of garlic here, a trace of smoked fish there, and frost laced the ground. The simple act of stirring the pot became something more than routine. The beaver's wide, flat appendage, slick with oil and covered in dark scales, resembled a fish to many observers. And in a world where classification was not only practical but theological, this resemblance mattered. But pottage remains the quiet anchor, the background hum of sustenance, neither exciting nor forgotten. Was it of the land or of the water? But to the medieval diner, especially those living near rivers in northern Europe, it was part of a broader understanding of nature as a hierarchy of usefulness. The tail, being especially fatty, offered a kind of luxury during days that otherwise called for restraint. It filled the stomach and soothed the appetite, even as it technically obeyed the letter of the law. That it came to be seen as permissible at all speaks not only to the ingenuity of medieval cooks, but to the deep intertwining of faith, food, and the physical world. One that, unlike the modest tale of the river beast, was designed not for fasting, but for spectacle. A pie that didn't just feed, but sang. If it swam like a fish and tasted like one when cooked, perhaps it counted. The idea of fish-like flesh from a mammal became less plausible, and the beaver tail passed quietly into the margins of dietary history. In a time when fasting was not a preference, but an obligation, small allowances like this became part of the culinary rhythm. A pot suspended over fire, something simmering within. Perhaps not fish, not truly, but close enough. For those at table, it mattered less what the animal once was, and more what the rules allowed it to be. Could something that lived in rivers, swam with such skill, and bore a tail so unmammalian be counted among the fish of God's creation? In the end, the answer, at least for the purpose of diet, was yes. At least, it was yes often enough for the tail to appear on fasting tables from time to time. A meal not of indulgence, but of quiet necessity, softly steaming, gently stirred, always there. The result was fatty, rich, and by all accounts distinct. Its texture has been likened to soft leather when dried, or gelatinous fat when cooked fresh. For those accustomed to lean fare during fast, simple fish, root vegetables, or cold bread, the oily richness of beaver tail would have been striking. It was care. It was memory. It was the preservation of something soft and warm against a world that was often neither. It may have crackled faintly over coals, or hissed in a low pan with herbs to cut its weight. There may have been thyme or wild garlic pressed into the meat. In some accounts, it was served with vinegar or mustard, a sharpness to counterbalance its natural heaviness. Each variation was small, but together they formed the collective rhythm of a community, simmering away in hundreds of pots across the countryside. The sound of its stir was slow and steady, a small circle drawn again and again through the center of the pot, like a quiet clock marking time. The church dictated many of these rules, especially when it came to what could be eaten on certain days. Friday, and many other holy days, required fasting from meat. But in a time when the calendar was thick with saints and seasons, people found curious ways to navigate the restrictions. Shared from a single bowl or dipped into with hunks of coarse bread, it filled the silence and the stomach in equal measure. In better times, there might be carrots or leeks, perhaps even a marrow bone cracked open for its richness. In leaner moments, it might stretch to include chestnuts, wild leaves, or a piece of yesterday's bread crumbled in with care. More than a meal, it was a presence, always there, always waiting, humming gently in a blackened cauldron suspended above glowing coals. Pottage was not a recipe. It was a concept and ongoing creation that changed with the seasons, with the weather, with the day's luck. It was not uncommon for a single pot to last several days, deepening in flavor as it sat, gently reheated and replenished with whatever could be spared. Over time, it grew thicker, more paste than broth, and the wooden spoon, well worn and darkened by use, stirred through a mixture more familiar than flavorful. The scent of pottage was not sharp or overwhelming. It was mild, muted by ash and age, but steady and ever-present note in the background of medieval life. Pottage was, in many ways, the answer to an uncertain world. When storms battered crops or war emptied pantries, the cauldron still held something. It could stretch, bend, and accommodate. A splash of ale from the bottom of the jug, a strip of dried apple, even a handful of snails gathered after rain, all could become part of the day's sustenance. It was a meal shaped by necessity, not preference, but within it lived the quiet creativity of survival. Its texture was soft, often lumpy, occasionally stringy with greens or thickened by bread or bean paste. In noble houses, pottage might appear dressed up with almonds, saffron, or small pieces of pork. In many villages, the smell of pottage drifted from door to door, tying one household to another. It's easy to imagine that in those darker months of winter, when daylight faded before supper, and so, as we leave behind the humble cauldron and its soft, simmering contents, we turn our attention to other foods, some stranger, some richer, some stranger still. In the medieval world, where the line between sacred observance and daily sustenance was often blurred, food had to fit not only the rhythms of hunger, but the rules of faith. One of the more peculiar adaptations involved the tale of the beaver. Though we may think of it now as a woodland creature, busy with dams and bark, the medieval mind saw it differently, especially when it came to its tail. Clerics, monks, and even bishops debated the nature of the beaver's tail. When prepared, beaver tail was typically boiled or roasted, sometimes smoked, and occasionally preserved in salt. The cooking of it was a quiet affair, carried out in kitchens more accustomed to fish pies or gruel. To modern ears, the idea of eating a beaver tail might sound strange, even uncomfortable. This practice was not widespread in every region, but where beavers were present, their tails occasionally graced the tables of both peasants and the monastic orders. Over time, as religious practices changed and hunting restrictions tightened, the beaver vanished from most parts of Europe. So too did its place in the kitchen. And yet, for a time, it was real and accepted its place, earned not through taste alone, but through classification, clever reasoning, and a willingness to adapt. Even now, it's possible to picture a cold stone kitchen in a riverside priory, the air scented faintly with smoke and river reed. As we leave behind the slow-cooked richness of beaver tail, we turn toward another dish both theatrical and unusual. Among the long wooden tables of medieval banquets, where torches flickered against stone walls and goblets clinked softly under vaulted ceilings, food was more than sustenance. It was performance. A silent message about power, wealth, and control over the unpredictable forces of nature. When the knife pierced the crust, and a fluttering of wings burst from within. Yes, this was a pie that sang. And few dishes embodied this theatrical elegance more than the curious blackbird pie. It wasn't merely about taste, though the rich pastry and savory filling had their place. It was about the moment before the eating began. Wings beat against the torchlight, feathers drifting like ash. Laughter followed. Surprise, sometimes applause. It was not uncommon for musicians to strike up a tune as the birds flew free, enhancing the spectacle. Others trace it to France or England, where noble households competed for grandeur. In a world where life was often short and unpredictable, displays of abundance, even fleeting ones, had weight. The birds lived, then flew. The pie opened, then emptied. What remained was not just a meal, but a story one whispered long after the torches had gone cold. To control nature, even for a moment, to orchestrate its behavior, was a kind of quiet power. The practice of baking live birds has long disappeared, replaced by more familiar meals and more humane customs. But in the dim echoes of great halls beneath tapestries long faded, one can almost imagine the soft rush of feathers. Out into the pale morning mist, baskets in hand, feet soft on dew-damp grass. A careful hand, or the hem of a tunic, could gather them without harm. They yielded food to those with patience. The young inner stalks, stripped and peeled, were tender enough to eat raw or cooked. Their flavor was gentle, mildly vegetal, not unlike celery, though often masked by the smoky scent of the hearth and the salt from preserved meats or fish. Once boiled, the sting faded, and what remained was something soft, almost silky. Mistakes could be costly. Some plants resembled their edible cousins, but brought illness or worse. But most villagers learned through repetition, through watching elders kneel beside hedgerows and listen to the soft rustle of wind through leaves. The pale stems of wild garlic pressed into bread dough, releasing a perfume that lifted the whole cottage. A splash of sour ale to brighten a bitter pot. A stone tucked into the coals to warm broth overnight. This kind of cooking was not celebrated. It was simply done. These were not grand flavors, but familiar ones. Humble, yes, but steady. Dependable. The gathering was often silent, a rhythm more than a task. Bend, cut, bundle, move on. Each green sprig a small promise of nourishment. Knowledge passed slowly, from hand to hand, from observation rather than books. The hedge became a classroom. The woods, a pantry. Goosefoot, fat hen, chickweed, all modest plants, easily overlooked, yet gathered with care and boiled until they lost their wildness. Earthy, herbal, touched by the smoke that clung to everything cooked over open flame. They soothed bellies when the larder was thin. They gave color to a landscape otherwise gray with ash and weather. The flavor varied with the season, brighter in spring, darker in autumn. In early months, when hunger for winter still lingered, even the smallest sprout was welcome. In lean years, people gathered whatever green could be softened and made safe. Not in search of delicacies, but of possibilities. Nettles, thistles, leaves with names known only in passing, yet remembered by the hand. Not plucked from nature's edge, but kept, fed, and bred for a purpose few today would imagine. Creatures of the coop, but not for eggs, or meat raised for something far more particular. A delicacy not of flesh, but of scent. Stirred into pots, shaped into cakes, dried for leaner times. A green thread, winding through the hard weave of medieval life. There were no salads in the modern sense. Leaves were not served crisp or fresh. They were softened, subdued, folded into broths or pastes, their textures thickened with oats or ground pulses. A deep green leaf, slightly bitter, tasting faintly of iron and soil. Nettles were often added to pottage or cooked with barley, forming a thick porridge that warmed both hands and belly. In the hedgerows and wooded fringes, people searched not for delicacies, but for edibles. Green things, wild and fibrous, tucked into the edges of fields and footpaths. In these quiet corners, the ingredients of survival brew. The startled chirp, the gasp of a guest, and the slow return to quiet as the real meal began. It's possible that stories of singing pies emerged before the real thing tailies turned into practice, fiction into fact. The tradition, though not always widespread, appeared in the late medieval period and into the Renaissance. A large pastry, hollow within, was filled not with meat at first, but with living birds. To fields, hedgerows, and the quiet foraging that defined most medieval meals. For while nobles played with pies, others turned to the wild to fill their bowls with what the land might offer, leaf by leaf, season by season. Often blackbirds, small and lively, chosen for their size and tendency to sing when startled. 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. It required wealth, resources, and a certain willingness to bend the natural order into something unexpected, and then, just as quickly, to let it go. Though the rhyme came later, it may echo the same practice, preserved in playful verse rather than in kitchens. They were placed inside the baked crust shortly before serving, sometimes through a hidden aperture. The dish would then be brought to the table, sealed and whole, and presented before guests. When the upper shell was removed, the birds, dazed by darkness and warmth, would escape in a burst of motion and noise. After the excitement, the real pie was served a second version, perhaps, or the one below the birds, depending on the occasion. This would be filled with minced meats, pigeon, veal, spices, and sometimes fruit, the delicate scent of mace or nutmeg rising with steam. A fleeting shadow on the tablecloth as a blackbird passed overhead. It was a moment crafted not for hunger, but for memory. To eat was one thing, to astonish another entirely. The crust, golden with egg yolk and faintly sweet from honey or dried dates, held together the layers of game and grain. Sensory memories from these feasts would linger, the warmth of the crust against the cool of the hall. The origins of this practice are uncertain. Some believe it began in Italy, where banquet culture often bordered on theatrical display. And while we may think of this as a cruel or absurd custom today, it's important to remember the context. This pie then was not only food. It was illusion, a temporary defiance of reality. Interestingly, this custom may have inspired the familiar nursery rhyme. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye. Blackbird pie was never common fare. It was rare, reserved for occasions where splendor was required. Today, of course, such dishes are gone. From this brief pageant of wings and wonder, we now descend once again to the ground. Long before markets brimmed with glossy vegetables, and long before kitchens stocked rows of jars and sacks from distant lands, most meals began with a walk. Nettles were among the most trusted. Their sting, sharp and immediate when touched, was no deterrent. Thistles, too, had their place. Though fierce in appearance, with spiked arms and tight-fisted blooms, other leaves joined the mix. Sorrel, with its soft sourness. Dandelion, bitter but nourishing. The scent of these dishes was mild, rooted in the land. Children were taught which leaves to pick and which to leave alone. In some places, Monks compiled herbals' careful records of plants and their uses. There were moments of softness too. Violet leaves gathered in spring, folded gently into gruel. Few recipes survive. The meals weren't written down. They lived instead in gestures. The handful had it here. The pinch dropped there. The plants from the hedgerow filled the spaces between. Between harvests, between fasts, between times of plenty. They made the difference between enough and not quite. And so, in the quiet of early spring or the slow fade of autumn light, the forager stepped out again. As we set aside the nettle-stained basket and let the fire ease to coals, we now look to something stranger. Not every dish from the medieval table was large or filling. Some were small, almost delicate, though no less complex. And few meals were as curious or as quietly controversial as those that involved the smallest birds. Not for pests nor poultry, but for songbirds. They were modest, almost weightless larks, sparrows, thrushes, their calls familiar, their presence unassuming. Their tiny bodies were brushed with oil or wrapped in vine leaves. Occasionally, they were skewered several to a spit or buried in pies beside fruit and spice. The meat was tender, often barely more than a mouthful. Even rose water, in some cases, was used to mask or accentuate the flavor. They didn't require a hunt, a field, or a horse. A patient child, a net, and a handful of grain might suffice. For poorer families, they filled a gap. Their appearance on the table marked a certain time of year. Spring brought fledglings. Autumn, migratory visitors. Their bodies, light as breath, echoed the transience of the seasons. Here, then gone. And the idea of eating a creature once admired for its music began to feel less like refinement and more like something left behind. A fleeting note, both on the branch and on the plate. For the wealthy, they became ornaments of the plate precisely arranged, meant to impress. But in medieval Europe, bread was not always so familiar, nor so certain. And in much of medieval Europe, those conditions were rare. When wheat was available, it was reserved for the upper classes baked into pale loaves, soft, white, and precious. For others, darker breads were the norm, made with rye, bar oats, denser, earthier, less refined. These legumes, while hearty, carried their own challenges. Even dried fruit, if any remained from earlier seasons. In wealthier homes, such breads might be flavored with honey or aniseed. But in poorer villages, the goal was simply to eat. Flavor was a luxury. Fullness, a blessing. When poorly stored, they could become hard or musty. Eaten slowly, chewed with patience, swallowed with water or weak ale. Ahead lies something unexpected, sweet but strange. A dish made not of grain or game, but of fish transformed into dessert, spiced and sugared, offered with pride. Its memory lingers not in taste, but in its quiet utility, a kind of edible endurance. Sometimes softened in ale, sometimes dipped into hot water, steeped with onions or scraps of salted fish. Some monks even developed guidelines for famine bread recipes that included bark, beans, and whatever could be spared. These documents, while dry, speak volumes about human resilience. In the margins of old manuscripts, faint notes remain. Adjustments, variations, quiet observations about what worked and what did not. The crust, dark and thick, could last for weeks. The inside, dense and moist, would slowly harden with time. Yet it was treasured. In years when harvests failed, a single coarse loaf could mean the difference between survival and decline. When overused, they led to digestive discomfort, spoken of only quietly in monastic records and household notes. It varied not just from place to place, but from season to season, and from year to year. A quiet perseverance. They were not made to please, but to endure. Their existence reminds us that food, in many times and places, was not about satisfaction. It was about making do. In times of scarcity, It changed shape entirely, sometimes into something that barely resembled bread at all. Not the thick, outer bark, but the soft inner layer known as cambium. This thin, fibrous membrane lay just beneath the surface and could be scraped carefully from the trunks of certain trees, pine, birch, or elm. It was then dried, ground into a coarse meal, and mixed with other available ingredients. The result was a sort of flour not nourishing in itself, but capable of extending what little grain remained. The hush of conversation, the dim light of oil lamps catching the gloss of a roasted wing. It was not abundance in the way we think of it today, but a different kind of richness rooted in rarity, subtlety, and ceremony. A memory of a dish both beautiful and strange, served not to fill, but to frame a moment. A dish best remembered not by how it tasted, but by the way it lingered, soft, ephemeral, and a little unreal. The texture was fibrous, almost woody. The smell faintly resinous, like distant smoke clinging to cloth. Some records speak of this bread as a last resort, a food of deep necessity. But it was made nonetheless, shaped into flat cakes, baked on stones or in the ashes, and eaten slowly, sometimes with broth, sometimes alone. These combinations may seem unfamiliar now, but in the medieval mind, contrasts of taste, sweet and sharp, rich and herbal, were part of a sophisticated palate. Others questioned the morality of consuming something so small, so close to nature's chorus. Yet the practice persisted, quietly, over centuries. In some places, it continues even now, though rarely, and under strict control. The flavor, intense, sometimes described as rich and dark, despite the bird's size. Yet in some circles, they were plucked from the air and turned into delicacies. In certain corners of Europe, where hedgerows ran dense and orchards dropped their fruit early, it was not uncommon for households to keep traps near windows, or nets stretched beneath low trees. These were not birds raised for eggs, nor hunted in vast flocks. When prepared, songbirds were most often roasted, not carved or dressed as larger fowl might be, but cooked whole, bones, beak, and all. But not for birds or leaves, for bread, or rather, what passed for it in times when wheat was rare, and hunger pressed harder than custom. The experience was not only in the taste, but in the act of eating a quiet pause, a measured bite, the sense of something fleeting. Meals like these were not meant to satisfy hunger, but to mark refinement. They were consumed slowly, sometimes between courses, or offered at banquets as a symbol of status. There was little waste. Everything was used. Bones cracked softly beneath the teeth, or were swallowed whole. Kitchens where these birds were cooked would grow warm quickly. The scent, delicate but strange, lingered in the air, clinging to linen and hearthstone. The aroma of roasting songbirds was distinctive, a mix of heat and feather, with undertones of thyme or wine, depending on the preparation. Songbirds were often served alongside sweet or acidic pairings, a sauce of currants or sour cherry, a dash of vinegar and crushed pepper. There were also practical reasons for these dishes. In times when large game was scarce, smaller birds were simply easier to catch, but not everyone approved. Religious voices occasionally condemned the practice, especially when birds were eaten during fasts. The birds themselves were seasonal. One can imagine the silence of a meal interrupted only by the faint crack of a beak, or the clink of small bones against pewter. As tastes shifted and traditions changed, roasted songbirds faded from most kitchens. Laws came protecting some species. Palates changed. Still, their story remains quiet, like their songs once were. Now, as we leave the warmth of the hearth and the scent of feathers, we turn our gaze toward the fields once again. In the modern world, bread is often taken for granted, sliced, soft, and uniform. Wheat, the grain most associated with fine bread, was difficult to grow in colder, wetter climates. It preferred warmth, dry summers, well-tilled land. But during times of famine or war, or flood, Even those grains could vanish from the fields. Then the ingenuity of the desperate emerged. One of the more unusual substitutes was tree bark. The bread made from this mixture was dense, heavy, and often bitter. It filled the stomach, but just barely. Other additions appeared in these improvised loaves, crushed acorns, once leached of their bitterness. Broad beans, ground into paste, or dried peas, crushed into flour. To soften the texture or mask the flavor, some added herbs, wild garlic, thyme, or nettles. Children would carry these rough loaves wrapped in cloth, eating them over days. Monasteries often kept records of such adaptations. Their kitchens, while better supplied, still adjusted when need arose. There is a kind of dignity in these rough loaves. And so, the bread of bark and beans took its place on the table, not as centerpiece, but as anchor. As the fire fades and the scent of smoke mingles with the earth-heavy loaf, we leave behind the scarcity of the field and the forest. Lent was a season of denial, a long stretch of quiet abstinence, often lasting over 40 days, when the medieval faithful refrained from meat, dairy, eggs, and animal fats. Yet even in this solemn interval, the appetite remained. Not the appetite for indulgence, necessarily, but for variety. And in that space between restriction and creativity, something peculiar emerged. Fish transformed into dessert. It might sound unlikely. Fish, with its briny scent and delicate flesh, hardly seemed suited to sweetness. But to the medieval cook, rules were simply ingredients in disguise. A mix of warm spice, almond, and something faintly marine subtle, like the sea carried in on a breeze, rather than splashed across the shore. In monastic kitchens and noble households, such dishes appeared now and then in records and recipe collections. The instructions were careful, the proportions precise. Sweetness was still expensive, after all. Sugar had to be imported. Almonds were a luxury. These fish-based sweets were not everyday fare, even in Lent. They were, in a quiet way, treats. When served, these desserts were accompanied by dried fruits, figs, dates, or raisins. It became something else entirely. A symbol, perhaps, of patience, of invention, of the small joys found even in seasons of restraint. A bit of preserved fish mixed with oat crumbs, honey, and dried herbs. Among the grandest and most peculiar displays of culinary pageantry was the presentation of a gilded peacock, not merely cooked, but costumed in gold and feathers, a creature reborn as spectacle. But the memory of those curious desserts, lightly scented, subtly spiced, lingered, like the final note of a chant echoing in stone. Imported and rare, they were admired more for appearance than for flavor. Their meat was often dry, the texture firm, and the taste somewhere between pheasant and goose, not unpleasant, but hardly prized. The skin and plumage were set aside, while the meat was roasted over a slow flame, often basted with aromatic oils or spiced wine to soften its nature. Under candlelight, it shimmered. More sculpture than supper, it sat at the center of the banquet table, silent and strange, surrounded by onlookers murmuring behind goblets and veils. At royal weddings or diplomatic banquets, the bird might be carried into the hall with trumpets or songs, heralded like a guest of honor rather than a dish. It was a bird transformed into symbol of power, of wealth, of control over nature. For most, it existed only in song and story, a whisper from kitchens far removed from their own. It was performance, a way of saying, without words, look what we can do. But the records remain. Illuminated manuscripts showing feathered birds atop gold-trimmed platters, servants in livery holding them high, tables stretching beneath tapestries and candelabras, feathered, golden, impossibly still. A reminder that food in the medieval world could be art, and that sometimes a meal was meant less to satisfy the belly than to stir the imagination. Once cooked, the cooled flesh was then redressed. The preserved skin was wrapped back over the bird's body. Stitched in others, its breast was carved ceremonially by the host, A token portion served while the rest was left untouched. Too dry, too symbolic, too rich for more than a taste, and smoothed to resemble its living form. The tail feathers were fanned out. The head, sometimes propped upright, retained its elegant curve. We step away from gold and grandeur now, towards something more humble, but no less unusual. A drink brewed from red, bitter herbs and slow fermentation. Not wine, not ale, but something stranger still. A dish shaped not by necessity, but by ceremony. Gilded and theatrical, meant to astonish more than nourish. A feast's centerpiece, shimmering beneath torchlight and laughter. At other times, it was accompanied by sugar-dusted fruits, dyed breads, or sauces made with clove, ginger, and wine. These additions were not to improve the flavor, but to complement the experience, to surround the bird with scents and colors that matched its majesty. It speaks to a broader theme in medieval life, the need to adapt, to transform, not only food, but meaning itself. In marginal notes written in slanted Latin or Middle French, take white fish, boil, flake, mix with bread and almonds. The instructions are brief. The implications quietly rich. To make something humble into something ceremonial. To find comfort in form, even when ingredients are scarce. Perhaps not quite dessert by modern standards, but something different. Something to remind the tongue that the world still held variation, even in times of restriction. In grander halls, they appeared near the end of a Lenten feast, delicately plated, sometimes shaped into animals or flowers. The flesh was gently poached, and flaked with care-removing bones, skin, and anything too assertive in scent. What remained was mild, faintly savory, and surprisingly adaptable. And so, with a monk's patience and a baker's imagination, fish often preserved, often modest, was slowly reshaped into something festive, even celebratory. And almonds, crushed and pressed to yield a paste. This almond mixture was rich, almost buttery, and when combined with rosewater, spices, and sweeteners like honey or cane sugar, it took on a soft, perfumed quality. The fish most often used was pike or haddock, though in some places salted cod stood in. To this base, breadcrumbs were added, sometimes from wheat bread saved from before Lent, dried and crumbled. The fish, now quiet in flavor, was folded into the mixture, its presence more structural than dominant. Shaped into balls or pressed into molds, these sweets were sometimes coated in cinnamon or wrapped in wafers. Occasionally, they were colored with saffron, shaded gold, or dusted with powdered sugar. They looked little like fish. They tasted even less so. The scent in the kitchen was strange, though not unpleasant. This practice was not universal, but it was known. Outside the manor kitchens, simpler versions were attempted. There is something almost meditative about this dish. The way it blurs boundaries between savory and sweet, between hunger and observance. The memory of these dishes survives not through taste, but through parchment, in cookbooks compiled by scribes and passed between households. And so, for a few weeks each year, fish wore the costume of dessert. As Lent faded and Easter approached, these dishes vanished once more. Eggs returned. Butter reappeared. The sweeter things resumed their familiar forms. Next, we'll step into a different kind of culinary strangeness. Not one born of fasting, but of festivity. At the highest tables of medieval Europe, food did more than nourish. It spoke. It announced wealth, affirmed hierarchy, and turned dinner into theater. Peacocks, with their fan of iridescent plumes and slow, deliberate stride, had long been symbols of vanity, pride, and beauty. Still, that hardly mattered. In the halls of nobility, the peacock's value was not on the tongue, but in the eye. The preparation was elaborate. First, the bird was carefully skinned, keeping the feathers intact, a process requiring steady hands and patience. To finish, the entire bird was brushed with a thin layer of beaten gold leaf, edible, though flavorless. Eating the bird was optional. In many cases, it was paraded, praised, and then whisked away. Sometimes, the peacock was filled with spices or smaller birds, its cavity a hidden trove of fragrance and novelty. In some feasts, the peacock bore more than feathers. It carried messages. A scroll tucked beneath its wing, a jewel suspended from its neck. Yet beneath the spectacle was a quiet irony. The peacock, admired for its natural beauty, was unmade and remade to resemble itself, its identity preserved, yet altered. Few outside the noble classes ever saw such a dish. To us, it may seem excessive, ornamental, even absurd. But in its time, a gilded peacock was not a mere dish. And so, it gleamed beneath vaulted ceilings. As the banquet winds down and candles flicker low, the echoes of laughter and lute fade. In the quiet corners of medieval life, where sunlight filtered softly through wooden shutters and hearth fires flickered low, drinks held a special place. They were not only a source of comfort, but often the safest nourishment available. Bread that had hardened, or was no longer suitable for eating, did not go to waste. Instead, it was broken into pieces, soaked in warm water, and combined with wild yeast or leftover yeast from previous batches. It was common among peasants, monks, and even some townsfolk. In monasteries, brewing was an art and a spiritual practice, with monks carefully monitoring temperatures and timing, recording recipes in illuminated manuscripts. The cool bitterness tempered thirst. The gentle bubbles whispered of slow alchemy and quiet patience. Wine was a luxury, often imported or carefully rationed. Beer and ale, brewed close to home, provided everyday relief. Their preparation varied widely, depending on local climate, available ingredients, and tradition. The taste was always a reminder of place, season, and circumstance. In taverns, alehouses, and homes, sharing a cup was an act of connection between neighbors, families, or fellow travelers on a dusty road. Their tangy notes lingered on the tongue, an acquired flavor that shaped the medieval palate. This was not the plain gruel often imagined, but a slow-cooked, fragrant dish, rich with texture and warmth. A quiet comfort in a world where few luxuries were certain. These brews might be stored in wooden barrels or clay jars, cooled in cellars thick with the scent of earth and stone. Oats, barley, rye, and sometimes wheat formed the base. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and ginger arrived from distant lands, carried along trade routes that stretched across deserts and seas. A mingling of toasted grain and gentle spice carried on a soft steam that rose slowly from the pot. It filled the room with a sense of calm, the kind of quiet reassurance found in a steady flame, and the routine of care. Their presence was faint but undeniable, weaving gentle warmth through the grains. Creamy, with occasional grainy bits that whispered of the harvest's coarseness. Sometimes it was served warm, other times cooled and formed into cakes, fried lightly to a golden crust. Of flavors crossing borders and blending in modest kitchens. Of meals taken in silence or shared in company, grounding people through the cycles of work and rest. The versatility spoke to a resourcefulness born of necessity, but also of care. Each spoonful was a gentle reminder of earth and effort, of soil turned, grain threshed, and fire tended, and simple foods eaten and cherished long ago, whispering still through history's soft shadows. Eating porridge was a moment of quiet nourishment amid the bustle of medieval life. Its gentle aroma invites the mind to slow, to drift, to rest. Monks gathered at set hours, breaking their fasts with bowls that sustained body and spirit. Recipes were recorded in manuscripts, instructions passed down with careful precision. The preparation was deliberate, not rushed, mirroring the contemplative pace of monastic life. These grains were soaked, sometimes ground coarsely, then simmered slowly over gentle heat. The porridge might be enriched with a splash of cream or broth, lending siltiness without heaviness. Sometimes, herbs like sage or rosemary were included, offering a fresh note beneath the spice. The result was a thick, hearty mass, soft enough to ease the tongue, yet substantial enough to fill the belly. Each sip was a small comfort, a brief escape, a touchstone of normalcy in a world often unsettled. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but for now, the bitter brew soothes the mind and quiets the day. For others, the process was simpler but no less vital. A way to turn stale bread and clean water into something sustaining. Slowly, over days, this mixture bubbled and transformed. Ahead lies our final chapter, a glimpse at a strange delicacy that few remember today. The medieval spiced porridge, simmered slow, thick with roots and secrets. Grain was often more plentiful than meat or fresh vegetables, making porridge a staple through seasons of plenty and want. The spices were less common, reserved for festivals or special occasions, yet even a pinch brought a small lift. Clean water was a rarity, sometimes carrying unseen dangers. These were festive, rare, and often reserved for celebrations or religious feasts. The mingling aromas of sweet and bitter, warm and tart, carried the spirit of transformation, turning humble ingredients into moments of joy. It was less sweet than modern beers, with a texture often described as gritty or coarse, carrying traces of the crust and crumb. The color ranged from pale amber to deep brown, depending on the bread used. These were flavored with ingredients like bog myrtle, yarrow, or heather plants that lent sharpness and complexity. Sometimes these brews had medicinal purposes, believed to aid digestion or ward off illness. They carried the scent of damp meadows, fresh herbs crushed between fingers, and sun-warmed bark. Unlike clear, filtered beers today, medieval bread beer held sediments and bits of grain, lending it a rustic, honest character. Instead, people turned to fermented beverages, not the refined wines of the upper classes, but simple brews, hearty and sometimes bitter, born of necessity and slow tradition. One such drink was bread beer, known in various regions by different names, but sharing a common root: the use of stale or baked bread as the fermentable base. The smell of bread beer as it fermented was earthy and yeasty, thick with the scent of grain and damp wood. Bread beer was nourishing in a quiet way. It provided calories and hydration, along with a mild intoxication that softened the edges of daily toil. Alongside bread beer, other bitter brews emerged, often made from herbs, roots, and grains beyond barley. These drinks were not consumed in great quantities. They accompanied meals or marked moments of rest. Notably absent from much of medieval Europe was the clear, sparkling wine familiar today. In some regions, sour beers, fermented longer or with wild yeasts, were common. Occasionally, more elaborate concoctions appeared mixing bread beer with honey, spices, or fruit juices. Drinking in the medieval world was a quiet ritual, grounded in the rhythms of daily life. It connected body and land, time and labor. As the night deepens and the last drops of bread beer settle in the cup, the senses soften. The earthiness lingers gently, inviting rest. And with that calm, we prepare to leave the simple tavern behind. As the medieval day unfolded with steady rhythms, the humble pot of porridge held a special place on the hearth. Porridge, in medieval times, was made from a variety of grains, depending on region and season. What set this porridge apart were the additions, subtle, aromatic touches that transformed it from simple sustenance into something memorable. In some recipes, honey or dried fruits, raisins, figs, or dates were stirred in, adding a muted sweetness that balanced the earthiness of the grains. The smell as it cooked was quietly inviting. In monasteries, porridge was both food and ritual. For peasants, porridge was a daily anchor. Cooked over open fires or in heavy pots placed near embers, it was reliable. The texture was important, not watery, but not stiff. In some regions, porridge was layered with other foods, butter, cheese, or cooked fruits, creating a simple but satisfying meal. Though plain by modern standards, Medieval spiced porridge carried within it a rich history, a history of travel, trade, and adaptation. As we close this chapter of culinary curiosities, the image of the simmering pot lingers, a vessel of warmth and tradition, quiet yet profound. With porridge behind us, we come now to the end of our journey, a quiet moment of reflection on these strange. As our journey through the curious and sometimes unexpected foods of the medieval world draws to a close, we are left with a gentle awareness. The meals of long ago were shaped by the rhythms of nature, by necessity, and by the subtle interplay of culture and circumstance. These dishes, whether gilded peacocks shimmering with gold, bread transformed into bubbling beer, or slow-simmered spiced porridge, carry whispers from a distant time. We have seen how food was more than sustenance. It was communication, a display of status, a comfort in hardship. The peacock, dressed in gold and feather, was a silent proclamation of wealth and art. The bread beer, humble and hearty, was a drink of community and practicality. The spiced porridge, slow and fragrant, was comfort in a bowl. The ingredients available, the methods used, and the flavors preferred all spoke of a world quite different from our own, yet also connected to us by shared human experience. Medieval people lived with the earth close beneath their feet and the changing seasons written in their kitchens. Their plates reflected the environment, the grains they grew, the animals they raised, the spices that traveled vast distances to reach their tables. The smells of hearth fires, the textures of coarse bread, the bitter tang of fermented brews. These were constants in daily life. And yet, within those constants were moments of creativity and care. We have not dwelled on hardship for its own sake, but rather acknowledged the realities, the struggles, the scarcity, the fragility of life that shaped what people ate and how they lived. The meals were sometimes simple, sometimes elaborate, but always part of a wider human story. As you settle deeper into calmness, perhaps these reflections can invite a quiet gratitude for the everyday pleasures we often take for granted. A warm meal, a shared drink, the textures and scents that nourish both body and mind. May the gentle rhythm of history's tastes carry you softly toward rest and the peaceful closing of the day. Thank you for accompanying this slow journey through medieval food, strange and familiar, distant yet intimate.